1 minute of video and trade talks between the two countries are put on hold. An Ontario government advertisement featuring Ronald Reagan's voice struck at the heart of Donald Trump's tariff policy, and the White House pulled the plug. Trump announced on social media that he was immediately halting all negotiations with Canada, calling Ottawa's actions outrageous, and stressing that tariffs are critical to the security and economy of the United States. He directly linked the decision to a video criticizing protectionism and accused Canada of interfering in internal affairs and attempting to influence the upcoming review of the legality of tariffs in the Supreme Court in early November. The reason was a 1-minute clip funded by the government of Canada's largest province. It used excerpts from Reagan's April 25, 1987 address, in which he called protective tariffs an outdated idea that stifles innovation and harms workers. The White House and the Reagan Foundation claimed that the meaning had been distorted and that the use was unauthorized. The Canadian side insists that the quote is from a public speech and has not been taken out of context. The stakes are high. According to provincial authorities, Ontario has invested about 75 million Canadian dollars, about 54 million US dollars, to air the clip on American channels, primarily in Republican regions. The goal is to sway public opinion within Trump's party and sow doubts about the protectionist course. The irony of history is obvious. It was under Reagan that the US and Canada signed the first bilateral free trade agreement, 1988, the forerunner of NAFTA. Today, his words are being heard again, this time as an argument in a new escalation between neighbors. The reaction from Washington was immediate. On Thursday evening, the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute issued a public statement condemning the unauthorized use of the image of the 40th US president in political advertising. In a statement posted on social network X, formerly Twitter, the Reagan Foundation said that the video, created by the Ontario government, distorts the essence of the speech, the president's radio address to the nation on free and fair trade from April 25, 1987. Representatives of the foundation emphasized that the Canadian side did not request permission to use and edit excerpts from the speech. The organization said it was exploring its legal options in connection with the unauthorized use of Reagan's speech, and called on the public to watch the full, uncut recording of the 1987 radio address for themselves, hinting that the Canadians had allegedly taken the quotes out of context. The White House also backed the criticism of Ontario. Donald Trump himself said that Canada had fraudulently used Reagan's image in false advertising, misrepresenting the former president's position on tariffs. The U.S. administration has made it clear that it considers such actions unacceptable on the part of a foreign government, especially a close ally from which it did not expect information attacks against the policies of the current president. In Canada, however, accusations of manipulation are categorically rejected. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who initiated the campaign, not only refused to back down, but also publicly demonstrated his determination to defend his message. In response to angry remarks from Washington, Ford posted the full video of Ronald Reagan's speech on social media, emphasizing that the United States and Canada are friends, neighbors, and allies, and Reagan knew that both are stronger when they stand together. The Ontario leader noted that Reagan's words were not distorted at all but were quoted directly from the original, simply adapted to the format of a short promotional clip. According to Ford, the goal of his campaign is to convey a transparent message to Americans, especially in states with a Republican majority. He called on his fellow Republicans in the U.S. to remember the principles of their outstanding leader of the past. These are genuine words. They come from the best president the U.S. has ever had, Ronald Reagan, Ford said, adding his hope that Reagan Republicans will be able to defeat the supporters of the MAGA, Make America Great Again, slogan, that is, the most radical wing of Trump's base. It is noteworthy that Doug Ford himself is a right-wing populist who heads the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario, while Premier Mark Carney is the leader of the Federal Liberal Party. However, in opposing Trump's tariff policy, the positions of Canada's different political camps have unexpectedly coincided. Both the right and the center-left agree that Washington's aggressive economic pressure threatens the country's national interests. Trump's announcement of the end of negotiations caught Ottawa in the midst of attempts to diffuse trade disputes. In recent months, Canadian and American officials have been engaged in intensive consultations, seeking to resolve at least the most acute differences over tariffs, in particular duties on steel, aluminum, and automotive and forestry products. Mark Carney's government argued in the negotiations that lowering tariffs on these goods would benefit American industry itself by facilitating access to raw materials for U.S. companies. Prime Minister Carney himself met with Trump in Washington just a few weeks ago in an attempt to find a solution to the contentious issues. The Canadian side then signaled its willingness to compromise. But now this channel of communication has effectively been frozen. As a result, the dialogue has been put on hold with a single stroke of the president's pen on social media. Trump's statement has effectively introduced new uncertainty into one of the world's largest trade relationships. The volume of goods and services exchanged between the US and Canada last year exceeded $900 billion. The Canadian dollar immediately fell in response to the increased risks. For observers, Washington's tactics came as no surprise. Since his return to the Oval Office, Trump has been using an unconventional style of trade negotiations, suddenly announcing on social media the introduction or cancellation of tariffs and agreements in an effort to put maximum pressure on his partners. Moreover, not only the US's strategic competitors are being targeted, but also its close allies. This is not the first time this year that President Trump has demonstratively broken off dialogue with Ottawa. Last summer, he similarly announced his withdrawal from negotiations and threatened new tariffs in response to Canada's digital services tax, aimed primarily at American IT corporations. At that time, the tough ultimatum had the desired effect. The Canadian government agreed to suspend the tax, after which contacts were resumed. It is possible that the current sharp statement is largely a bargaining tactic and an attempt to force the Canadians to abandon their own measures or make concessions. Some analysts believe that the brinkmanship, the tactic of balancing on the brink of conflict, for which Trump is famous, is often ostentatious and does not usually drag on if his opponents comply with his conditions. Financial markets also reacted cautiously to the new flare-up. As one expert noted in an interview with Bloomberg, investors have seen this movie before and know that Trump's sharp moves in trade rarely last long. Nevertheless, the risk of a full-scale tariff war between the two economies remains, and political relations between Washington and Ottawa continue to heat up. At the same time, this scandal fits into the broader context of rapidly changing US-Canadian relations. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, currently on a visit to Asia, is promoting a policy of less dependence on the US. His government has set a goal of doubling exports to countries outside the US over the next 10 years to reduce Canada's economic vulnerability. Against the backdrop of Washington's tough tariff policy, such steps by Ottawa indicate a structural shift in the North American economy. The contradictions go beyond a one-off quarrel over a video and reflect fundamental changes in trade relations between the two countries. For Canada, the conflict over the Reagan commercial is only part of a much larger problem. As Ottawa openly acknowledges, the country's economic strategy is undergoing a necessary review after decades of close integration with the American market. We cannot control the trade policy of the United States. We need to realize that it has changed radically since the 1980s, said Prime Minister Mark Carney, commenting on the protracted tariff friction. We must focus on what we can control and accept what we cannot change, he added, speaking before leaving on his first Asian tour as head of government. Since taking office earlier this year, Carney has made reducing dependence on the US one of the central points of his economic agenda. Back in March, he stated bluntly that the previous model of economic relations with the US, based on deepening mutual integration, was over and that Canada needed to fundamentally reorient its economy. In October, on the eve of the presentation of the new federal budget, Carney's government officially announced its goal of doubling exports to countries outside the US within a decade. If we don't act now, the pressure on our economy will only grow, the Prime Minister warned, as he unveiled an initiative to diversify trade ties. According to him, the transformation of the economy's structure will not be easy or quick. It will require sacrifices and take time, but there is no other way out. To support this shift in foreign trade, Ottawa is preparing large-scale investments in domestic infrastructure, from energy and mining to port expansion, in order to redirect resources and flows to new markets. It is significant that Carney announced his strategic economic course on the eve of his trip to Asia. This is his first visit to the Asian region as head of government, and his main task is to establish new business alliances and trade agreements, weakening excessive dependence on the American market. The Canadian leader plans to attend the ASEAN and APEC summits, where he will meet with Donald Trump. Theoretically, these platforms could provide an opportunity for behind-the-scenes contacts and diffusing tensions. However, the rhetoric on both sides remains harsh. Carney, for his part, stressed that Ottawa is always ready to continue the dialogue on reducing tariffs, but at the same time made it clear that the country does not intend to put all its eggs in one basket and must take care of its own economic security. Recent events clearly show that this is not just about one unsuccessful commercial or Donald Trump's personal grievance. deeper contradictions have emerged between the US and Canada, leading to a gradual drift of the two economies away from each other. Over the past 30 years since the 1988 Free Trade Agreement and later under NAFTA/USMCA, the economies of North America have become increasingly intertwined. Ontario's auto plants worked in unison with Michigan's, Canadian oil flowed to American refineries, and American high-tech goods crossed the border northward without hindrance. Now, however, this established order is cracking. The Trump administration's protectionist policies and constant threats of tariffs are forcing Canada to rethink the fundamental principles of its foreign trade. Ottawa can no longer view Washington as a reliable economic partner. It is now seen more as a potential source of risk. In response, Canada is seeking to expand its circle of partners, from Europe, with which it has a CETA free trade agreement, to the fast-growing markets of Asia and Latin America, including through participation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is not a quick process, but in the long term it has the potential to change the entire architecture of the North American economy. The escalation surrounding the Reagan video has become a kind of litmus test for these changes. A quote from the past, the voice of a president who once proclaimed the principles of free trade, has now become a source of conflict between allies. Moreover, this story has highlighted the ideological divide within the U.S. Republican Party itself. Reagan's free market principles have clashed with the economic nationalism of the Trump era. Many traditional conservatives in America still agree with Reagan's free market ideas. But the influence of Trumpism is now so great that few Republican leaders dare to openly oppose the president, even if the argument comes from Reagan himself. If even such symbols are being used, it is clear that the rift in understanding between Ottawa and Washington is growing deeper. What are the risks of further escalation? For the Canadian economy, new U.S. tariffs or prolonged uncertainty mean billions of dollars in losses and slower growth, given that about 3/4 of Canada's exports still go to the U.S. market. American companies and consumers will also feel the costs, from higher prices for imported raw materials and components to Ottawa's retaliatory measures. Business communities on both sides of the border are already expressing concern. Steel and auto parts manufacturers, farmers, and representatives of other sectors of the economy warn that disrupting supply chains that have been established over decades will cause long-term damage to both the U.S. and Canada. The integrated economies of both countries react painfully to each new barrier, and pressure from businesses demanding that the authorities return to the negotiating table will only increase. Both governments say they do not want a complete breakdown in relations. Negotiators on both sides of the border have made it clear in recent days that they are ready to return to dialogue as soon as they receive a political signal from above. However, the U.S. president remains uncompromising, while in Canada there is a growing bipartisan consensus on the need for a Plan B in case of Washington's unpredictability. North American neighbors have already experienced serious disputes, ranging from economic disagreements to geopolitical ones. Remember Ottawa's refusal to support the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. But for many years, the economic alliance remained the unshakable core of bilateral relations. Now, even this foundation is being called into question. The scandal surrounding Reagan's vote is a notable episode in a new reality, where old agreements no longer guarantee stability, and high-profile public actions can have tangible consequences for real trade. Canada is making it clear that it is shifting to a more independent course. The United States is showing that it will not tolerate even its allies taking actions that it considers a challenge to its policies. Whether pragmatic calculation or emotions and principles will prevail will become clear in the coming months, when the smoke from the latest war of words begins to clear. For now, one thing is clear. The era of eternal mutual benefit in trade between the U.S. and Canada has been replaced by a period of uncertainty and nervous balancing on the brink of conflict.